Okay, hi everybody. Just for students who are here, the ethics link is on that whiteboard. So at the end of the event, you can go up and take a picture of that. But if you have any issues, just email me and I can email it to you. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this second webinar event on Nuremberg Principles. And I would like to thank everybody who helped us to make this workshop possible, especially our panelists, Professor Shvedo, Professor Kitri, who is participating remotely, and panelist and organizer, Professor Regenbogen. And I would also like to especially thank Professor Roman Patur at Taras Shevchenko University in Ukraine for his help with the workshop's content and inviting workshop participants remotely from Ukraine. I'm grateful to many members of our law school staff, especially our marketing and communications director, Joe Ferraro, our web design and content manager, Al Washington, media services director, Greg Stack, Len Davidson, also media services, our assistant director for student life, Renee Stack, senior associate dean for academic affairs, Megan LaBelle, assistant dean for student affairs, Gemma Forrest, assistant registrar, Natalie Picillo, and director, offices of institutes and special programs, Constantia Dedulis, as well as our president of our co-sponsoring Student International Law Student Society, Jennifer Rodriguez. I would also like to thank all of you for coming today. And I'm particularly grateful for the participation of CUA students, faculty, and staff, and for the participation of those of you in more far-flung locations, including across the US, in Poland, and in Ukraine. And this is the second in a series of 3 workshops on the Nuremberg Principles, a set of guidelines designed to prevent aggressive war and hold accountable those who violate the rule of law. These principles are widely recognized as customary international law. Today, our panelists will examine how the Nuremberg Principles intersect with international economic institutions and international criminal justice institutions set up as part of our post-war, what we had called our new world order last time. Professor Shvedo will particularly focus on economic institutions such as the World Trade Organization, and Professor Kitri on international criminal justice, and in particular, the International Court of Justice and the use of lawfare, that is, law as a weapon to counteract aggression and impose accountability. Our third panelist, Professor Regenbogen, will consider how the Nuremberg Principles and post-war economic and criminal justice are under threat in international relations, including from the rise of aggressive war, threats and use of military force, and the rejection of international legal constraints by some national leaders. We invite all attendees to collaborate in our discussion of these issues to the extent possible in this hybrid in-person and Zoom webinar format. Once the panelists deliver their initial remarks, we will move to discussion, and you'll be invited to submit questions and comments at that time. So you can just raise your hand if you're here in person. And if you're participating over Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A features in the Zoom. And we also invite you to continue the discussion afterwards if you wish by emailing me after the event with thoughts and questions. My email is Fischer, Fischer, @law.edu. So now I would like to turn the floor over to our first panelist, Professor Piotr Shvedo, who is here with us from Poland for, I think, about 10 days, is that right? And also teaching a class for us on international trade. So the floor is yours, Professor Shvedo. Wherever you would prefer.
I think I may stay here.
Absolutely, that's perfect.
And should I turn the mic on, or it's all set?
The mic is on, but if you move it closer, if you pull it towards you, that's...
Yeah, that's right, because it's hybrid, you have to pay attention to different... I have 2 microphones.
There you go.
I feel a little bit like lonely impression if you used to talk. Thank you very much for introducing me. I must start by thanking first and foremost Catholic University of America. I know this institution for 23 years, if I calculated correctly, and I started this connection as a student of the American Law program. And then through different avenues and connections, I'm already here for the second time as a visiting professor. It's an enormous honor. I thank particular individuals, like Susanna Fisher, like Professor Lee Wharton, for remembering about us and being extremely generous with your time and energy, in investing your time and energy in our cooperation. Well, my introductory speech would be about certain common denominators between Nuremberg Principles and the current and past institutions of international trade and economic law. Well, it's not a very intuitive common denominator, I would say. I mean, we say that international law is fragmented. In that sense, there are different planets, which we call, in a metaphoric sense, which have their own institutions, and there is general international law, which serves as a universe for international relations. And very often there's a very little connection between those planets. But if they exist, we have to understand them well to understand how international law functions. And also we have to understand, and it's not a very legal premise which I want to start with, is that history is not necessarily a linear process. It develops through events and moments of acceleration, and then certain moments and times of stability or stagnation, right? This is not a very linear process. For sure, 1940s and the beginning of 1950s, so the Second World War and the period right after, was a moment of acceleration and a moment of construction of different new institutions, which later on served or still serve as pillars of international legal order. These were mostly two pillars, one in which is, I would say, institutional and political, which is something around United Nations, which were constructed at San Francisco Conference. But not necessarily everyone understands it. On the other hand, because it's not necessarily everyone understands, because this is now, I would say, it's not the mainstream part of the regular international public law, of course, which is in manual. Usually it's one of the last chapters, or sometimes you have even manuals of international law where it's even not covered. And there are still institutions of international economic law, which are called Bretton Woods Conference institutions, which were born in a very similar period. There were a lot of interconnections, but they function separately. And the common denominator of those two pillars was to secure peace, security, and predictability. And behind the Bretton Woods Conference, there was this belief that if we eliminate trade barriers, if we foster free trade, if we promote this idea, then we build interconnections between states, also between private companies, between private individuals, which are also actors to some extent of international public law. And it was a kind of lesson learned after the First World War, because after the First World War, what happened was that losing countries were punished very severely, some people would say. It created a very high level of poverty and also frustration of society. For example, in Germany, this was one of the factors which led to the Second World War. There are many factors, but this was one of the social factors which then historians and political scientists analyzed, took into account. On a side note, if we talk about the post-First World War frustration, if you go to Hungary one day and you talk to Hungarians about not the Versailles Treaty, but the Trianon Treaty. So I'm not sure if you ever visited Paris and Versailles. So Versailles has this one big chateau where the main conference took place, but there's a small little chateau which is called Trianon, and this is where the treaty with Hungary was signed. Until now, Hungary lost 60% of its territory, and until now they remember this. This is for Hungarians, Trianon Treaty is a symbol of humiliation until now. So, in order to avoid such scenarios, there was this very generous idea of the U.S. government to provide a Marshall Fund and to distribute it inter alia via International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which is now called the World Bank and which is downtown DC, right? And which is still serving to preserve stability, which is providing loans and credits to developing countries to construct infrastructure, to help them with different economic projects. The second very important institution was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is also here downtown in DC, right? Which had the function to help central banks to stabilize their currencies, right? How you stabilize currency, one of the things you have to monitor is the inflation rate. In order to monitor and stabilize your currency, you need, for example, to redistribute different economic risks. For example, by buying currencies of other countries or buying gold. This is what the IMF is also helping with. Before the Second World War, it was not so easy to buy currencies of other countries, right? That's why the risk very often was not evenly distributed. That's why in different countries you had very severe economic crisis. And there was this idea of creating the International Trade Organization, the idea which did not work out, actually, also for political reasons. It was an American idea, which was initiated by the United States, but then it was stopped by the United States, also for political reasons, because there was this insecurity that maybe the ITO as a treaty could interfere too far into domestic matters, for example, with workers' rights. Okay, it was a very ambitious political project. That's why the only part which remained from the ITO was so-called the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which had main function just to eliminate what we call the quantitative restrictions, so the quotas, and replace them by the famous tariffs. We talk about tariffs quite often nowadays. The American administration is promoting my course almost everything. And GATT lasted 1940s until 1990s, because then we have another moment of very important acceleration, which is the fall of the Eastern Bloc. Right? And we as humanity, also as scholars, we believed once that Eastern Bloc, which was a certain economic alternative to the Western capitalistic model, that if the Eastern Bloc has failed, now we have just one alternative, and this is the paradigm forever. That's why the process of liberalization of trade in the 1990s accelerated, right? The WTO was created after the so-called Marrakesh Agreement, which was signed in 1994, and the World Trade Organization was established in Geneva, right? And the former socialist countries like Poland joined the system, and this is a moment where also in the history of economic relations, you observe a very important acceleration. Also, those countries which transform their economies, they transform it in a very neoliberal way, right? So there was this belief that only privatization, only free trade is the only solution which we have. And of course, this paradigm is changing now, right? We reached the limits of this paradigm. We don't know exactly when. You can mark certain points which are denominators or factors of which describe the crisis of this model. One of the very important points of criticism, and this is what actually links also my topic to Nuremberg Principles. So Nuremberg Principles are very often, and you find it in the manuals of international public law, a reflection of natural law, right? So those eternal, intuitive principles which everyone has in the conscience, that, for example, crime should be punished, it should bring some kind of consequences, that we need to bring justice to society. Society has to see it, because if they do not see it, they do not believe in justice at all, etc., etc. So there are certain values which are non-economic, which are very, very important for us, and it's very difficult to quantify it. This is something that we believe has to be integrated into this neoliberal economic model. And the limits are the following: that we observed after let's say, the first decade of the 21st century, that this neoliberal model is not embracing those values sufficiently. For example, the environmental dimension, right? We say that the environmental dimension and exploitation of natural resources went too far in different countries. That's why many countries and many states, many societies reject this model. Because, for example, I work a little bit with Latin American colleagues, and in many countries there is this moment of contestation and of this what they call colonial Western model of law, right? There's also another point of critique against international public law that is too Eurocentric. It's a product of a Western culture. It's not embracing other legal cultures sufficiently. It's a very interesting discussion, which we also try to follow. But this is so on the one hand, you have this environmental dimension. On the other hand, you clearly see that this neoliberal model quite often was forgetting other social values, right, which are embraced very often or expressed through human rights, through workers' rights, etc. And on the top of that, which is many politicians know, this neoliberal model brought us so-called free riders. So those countries which did not necessarily contribute to the construction of this model, but benefited out of it. And of course, I'm talking now about China, right, which is very often where and still to some extent accused of being a free riders of this system. So what is for sure, we are now, I think, at the moment where this neoliberal model is reaching its end as we knew it in the 1990s. It will be reconstructed. That's why I think we are facing, that's why the WTO is a deep, deep crisis. And it's not a coincidence that we're facing different military conflicts in different parts of the world, right? The Middle East, the Ukraine, etc., etc. Taiwan is another possible area of conflict, which is not only hypothetical. This is not a coincidence that the moment of protectionism which we are facing, so tariffs, right? It's very often the moment which is a certain prelude to military conflicts, unfortunately, right? We know it from the history. Historia est magistra vitae. History is a teacher of life, as we say. So we do not only learn history because we are obsessed about learning dates by heart, but we want to understand certain processes. And by observation, it's like a weather forecast, right? So we see there is a lot of tariffs around the world. So they are like clouds. Usually, when you see clouds on the horizon, you may have rain, you may have a blizzard, you may have whatever. It depends, right? So this simulation is showing us that probably the world order will be reconstructed. We don't know how and to what extent. That's why we face certain chaos in international relations. Maybe I will suspend my talk here. I'll be happy to take questions or hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Professor Schmidt. So I think we'll hold on for the questions and discussions until we hear from all the panelists, and then we can ask questions which you can direct to a specific panelist or to everyone. So now I would like to invite Professor Kitri to speak. Professor Kitri is speaking remotely. Hope you can hear me. Can you hear me, Professor Kitri?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hello, so the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss preventing military conflicts through trade and international law. My presentation is drawn in part from my book, Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War, published by Oxford University Press and available on Amazon and elsewhere. My presentation is also based on my work as a lawfare practitioner, including currently as a professor and as director of the Arizona State University program on international security and lawfare. I also served from 2019 to 2025 as a part-time counselor on lawfare to the NATO legal advisor, and prior to that as a U.S. State Department and policy official for 11 years. My comments today are my personal capacity and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization with which I'm associated. I'll first discuss the trade angle and then very briefly the international law angle. I come at both from the perspective of lawfare. The term lawfare was coined in 2001 by Major General Charles Dunlap, the U.S. Air Force's former Deputy Judge Advocate General. He defined lawfare as the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a warfighting objective. Dunlap also noted that lawfare is simply another kind of weapon, one that is produced, metaphorically speaking, by beating law books into swords. Four major factors are making lawfare an increasingly powerful and prevalent tool in 21st century conflicts, including potentially the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Number one, there are an increasing number of international laws and tribunals to leverage. Governments worldwide have entered into more than 45,000 bilateral treaties and 8,000 multilateral treaties since World War II. In addition, several international tribunals applying international law have been created in recent decades, especially including the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice, meanwhile, is, for better or for worse, issuing advisory opinions and other opinions on a wider and more sensitive range of topics. A final factor in the thickening web of international law has been the increased prevalence of universal jurisdiction laws and prosecutions, which authorize governments to prosecute persons for particular crimes, even when the accused is not a national of that country and the crime did not otherwise involve that country. So that's one factor, making lawfare an increasingly powerful and prevalent tool, the increasing number of international laws and tribunals. Another factor is the NGOs, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, that are raising awareness of international law as they interpret it, collect data, and accuse countries of violations, promoting the strengthening of international laws and sometimes instigating legal action. It's important to note that human rights NGOs have far less impact on autocratic countries like China and Russia and on terrorist groups that are less responsive to such groups' opinions. As discussed in my book, that contributes to such autocratic countries and terrorist groups engaging in what I call compliance leverage disparity lawfare. For example, they use human shields, a type of lawfare designed to gain advantage from the greater leverage that international law and its processes exert over the US and other democracies. Third factor, making lawfare more powerful. And then in a moment, I'll discuss how these have and have not worked out vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Third factor, the vast increase in online data availability has enabled governmental and even non-governmental lawfare practitioners located anywhere on Earth to quickly find and deploy many types of information at the level of detail and timeliness necessary to wage lawfare. At the same time, personal communications technology and the proliferation of online media outlets have enabled NGOs and even individuals to, in some cases, record and disseminate remarkable evidence of war crimes and other violations of international law. For example, researchers collecting evidence in Bucha and other places, which Ukraine captured from Russia, have produced detailed dossiers linking particular perpetrators to specific crimes. In addition, the rise of social media enables far more actors, including autocratic governments and other propagandists, to flood the information domain in Western countries with accurate or misleading or false allegations. The final major reason for the increasing power and prevalence of lawfare is the advance of globalization, which has vastly increased governments' non-kinetic leverage over other countries and their companies by intensifying international economic interdependence. Economic lawfare against state actors, such as the PRC, Iran, and Russia, is facilitated both by their own heavy dependence on international trade and by the economic interdependence of third countries. Many third countries may be unwilling to help hinder or impose costs for Russia's invasion of Ukraine because they see that as political or as not implicating their core interests. But when, for example, Russia's misuse of the financial system is portrayed as undercutting the integrity of the international financial system on which most countries are now very dependent, it becomes easier for countries, third countries, to get involved. So the rise of globalization has, at least in theory, meant that trade could be used to prevent or minimize war. In practice, this has not occurred. It's a tremendous missed opportunity, in my view. Let's take a look at Russia's war against Ukraine. It's expensive. The military costs to Russia of its war against Ukraine are reportedly at least 40% of the Russian government budget. 40% of the Russian government budget. Now, since Russia invaded Ukraine, some 45 countries have directed more than 5,000 sanctions at Russian officials, including institutions and companies, targeting everything from diamonds and semiconductors to Putin himself. Putin called it an economic blitzkrieg. At first, this economic blitzkrieg looked like it was going to make a difference. Within a week of the invasion, the U.S. and its allies blocked Russia's central bank from accessing $300 billion it had stashed around the world and froze the foreign bank accounts of dozens of Russian billionaires. In 2022, the U.S. architect of the economic sanctions on Russia predicted they would bring Russia's economy to its knees. But that did not happen. Why 3 years later have the economic sanctions failed to bring Russia's economy to its knees? The biggest hole in the sanctions is Russia's energy exports. About $100 billion per year to China, about $50 billion per year to India, and about $20 billion per year to Europe. In 2024, Russia's oil and gas export revenues totaled some $240 billion, the profit from which was enough to cover some 30% of Russia's total federal budget that year. Remember, a few minutes ago, I told you that military costs to Russia of its war against Ukraine are about 40% of the Russian government budget. Well, oil and gas revenues are equivalent to most of the cost of Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, 2025, the West has finally begun to get serious about restricting those revenues. But what does it mean? Well, 2025, the U.S. began to use lawfare to more aggressively squeeze those revenues, so they declined to some $200 billion, covering about 23% of the state budget. This had an impact. It forced Putin to boost taxes and deficit spending to fund the war. And Q&A, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about how this was done and what more needs to be done to cut off the fact that the rest of the world is basically paying for Russia's war against Ukraine. Unfortunately, another key lifeblood of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is Western-made microchips, continue to flow into Russia largely unabated. It turns out that most of Russia's advanced weapons have been built around Western parts and components. Western investigators pulling apart advanced Russian weapons captured in Ukraine, including drones, have discovered that almost all of it is parts from companies based in the US and the European Union. Microchips, circuit boards, engines, antenna, and other equipment. This is not just speculation. A very thorough U.S. Senate report issued in December 2024 found that U.S. manufactured semiconductors have been found in a range of military equipment used by Russia, including some of Russia's most modern military systems. Most of this technology is dual use. It may have been exported to Russia as a part for a civilian automobile or even a washing machine, but it was diverted for use in a weapon. So the bad news is that the Russian weapons being used to destroy Ukraine and its citizens are largely powered by Western technology. The first Soviet leader, Vladimir Lenin, is reported to have said, quote, "Those capitalists, they will sell us the rope with which we will hang them." 100 years later, there's plenty of evidence that Lenin was correct. The good news is that this provides an opportunity. The West could leverage this dependency against Russia. Indeed, it succeeded in doing so for the first half year or so after Russia invaded Ukraine. Government restrictions and industry efforts early on in the war initially led to a 90% drop in global exports of semiconductors to Russia. Unfortunately, the effort to prevent Russia from acquiring dual-use items has become less effective over time. U.S. semiconductors continue to flow from the factories of the West's leading manufacturers, including Texas Instruments, Intel, and AMD, to third countries, particularly China, which then ship those goods on to Russia, a process referred to as diversion. It seems to me there's much more that could be done to stop that. The U.S. Senate report slammed the efficiency of U.S. government efforts to enforce U.S. laws and prevent U.S. manufactured microchips from getting to Russia. It said U.S. semiconductor manufacture efforts have been abjectly lacking, in part because enforcement of export controls is a shadow of what it should be and inadequate at every level. This is basic economic lawfare. Multinational companies change behavior when one of them is caught and hammered with fines. I have written extensively about what happened to multinational banks doing business with Iran. They stopped doing business with Iran after a series of massive U.S. imposed penalties, culminating with an $8.9 billion fine on BNP Paribas. Unfortunately, nothing similar has been done regarding the flow of microchips to Russia. As a result, as the U.S. Senate's own report said, quote, "U.S. microchips continue to guide and power the Russian weapons that kill Ukrainians daily." I want to turn very briefly now to the international law side of the ledger. I know Professor Regenbogen is an expert on that, so I'm going to leave the discussion of that to him. I'll just say that in my view, the ICC and ICJ have been great disappointments. I think they've contributed to how badly Russia is outplaying the West in the international arena. You have to ask yourself, why have only about 45 of the 193 UN member states joined in Western sanctions against Russia for legally invading Ukraine? It seems to me Ukraine and the West have a far better claim to having law on their side, but Russian propaganda has been so effective in using legal tropes to claim legitimacy that even some senior officials in the West have begun to echo them. That's lawfare, the use of law as a propaganda tool. We have to do better. With regard to the ICJ, the ICC in particular, there's a good recent piece by Steve Pomper in int'l, which I recommend. It notes that although the ICC warrants have cramped Putin's mobility, they have not isolated him, they have not weakened him politically, they have not softened his battlefield resolve, and they have not deterred Russian attacks on civilians. Meanwhile, the efficacy of the ICJ as a means for accountability for aggressive law is clearly in question following the recent developments in the ICJ in the Russia versus Ukraine case. This was most recently addressed in December 2025 in the ICJ's order on the admissibility of Russia's counterclaims. The ICJ, by 11 votes to 4, allowed Russia to proceed with its counterclaims that Ukraine has committed genocide, attempted genocide, is complicit in genocide, conspired to commit genocide, incited genocide, failed to prevent, investigate, and punish genocide, and failed to enact necessary legislation and provide effective penalties for genocide. This is right. Ukraine, that is the subject of genocide. Indeed, Russia further requested the court to order Ukraine to make make full reparation for its alleged violations of the Genocide Convention. So now, even more than before, Ukraine has to defend itself against the allegation of genocide rather than the other way around. So my picture is fairly grim. I think both international trade law and international law more broadly at the ICC and ICJ have been utter and complete failures when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. And I could talk about how they've also been utter and complete failures with regard to other conflicts, but I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Kittrey. And again, we'll hold questions and comments on Professor Kittrey's presentation until after we hear from our final panelist, Professor Reagan Bogan. So please, Professor Reagan Bogan.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Fascinating how we can learn, on the one hand, globalization is expanding and protectionism at the same time is persisting. These are paradigms. Paradigms that influence how you have a narrative. Each of you have a narrative. And question that narrative. Every time, every moment, every way you go. Because that narrative is an illusion. Subjective. But it's not your reality. But if you can't make a reality out of what is evil, what is barbaric, what is so dehumanizing, then you don't have yet understood what are the principles. For that is the Nuremberg Principles. The dehumanization, the killing, the extortion, the very things that you cannot even imagine occurred in the Holocaust and occurred in Ukraine. It's barbarism. And if you can't put Putin in that label, you're putting him in something of where an echelon, an ideal state, where you can say, well, we can communicate. You can communicate with criminals. Yes. And they're very logical, very smart. But let's remember who is guilty of genocide and who is barbaric in terms of the treatment and the war that has occurred since February 24th, 2022. And now we have the 5th year going on. And for that reason, we have to look at the questions of our principles, our personal principles. You don't have to go out into the theory of another concept. Begin with yourself and your understanding of your principles. And then you will understand the principles that are being advocated at another. So if you begin with yourself in terms of the principles you believe in, then it's very well that these Nuremberg principles will reflect your own beliefs. And the question is, do you follow your principles? That is a human question. And that humanization is the very essence of why we have failed to understand the calamity we are facing today. The facing today is the end of the New World Order, some would say. Or we will understand and we will begin to manage and emerge from this disaster, this disruption, this entire calamity here in the United States and in the world around us. And that means we need to pose a new idea of not about values, it's about principles. There's a major difference. That transformation is what is going on right now, here in Congress, in the think tanks, in other places around the world. It's about reconstructing our understanding of the world order and to identify what are the deficiencies. So we cannot just leave countries say, well, I'll take care of this through might makes right. No, we have a very understanding of how war is unlawful. And that was created in the 1928, before the Nuremberg Principles, before all these New World Order arose. And at the same time, at that outlawed the use of war as legitimacy, another institution arose in an international crisis called the Great Depression of 1929, or in England called the Great Slum of 1931. And that institution is the Bank for International Settlements. You don't hear much about it because it's very private. It's about central banks, central bankers meeting together from Russia, from anywhere you can imagine, Example, World War II. Americans met with Nazis. Yes, that was the committee. That were the central bankers. And again, this was about an institution, an organization that should exist during times of peace and times of war. They have no principles in the sense of, well, this is right and wrong. No, their foundation is the very foundation of capitalism. It's a foundation why $300 million in Russian sovereign debt or sovereign assets are not being liquidated and paid to the Ukrainians for reconstruction. Why? The reason is if you did that, and they always say there's all kinds of legal problems. The problem is very simple. Your entire currencies would be immediately devalued. And you will have another Great Depression, maybe even worse. This is the reason. Nobody speaks about it. And the reason is that this Bank for International Settlements is very, very important. The very foundation of our understanding of finance, not economics, finance. So when you talk about the Bretton Woods, as was mentioned, we talk about finance as well. And that's a whole different animal. A category that really relies on a real understanding of how this works. I won't have time to go into detail, but I think this subject is more important than others in terms of understanding our hesitancy to deal with real objectives and how we bring together principles and our economic interests and financial interests. And we understand the finances, we'll also understand what we need to do. If we have problems stopping war criminals, we have to find out why. What is it about? What is harboring us from doing what is really justice? Because that's really the principle of Nuremberg, seeking justice. It's an abstract word, but everybody would understand it if they see it. You don't have to really ask so many questions. You know it because it's natural. If a woman is raped, you know what that's wrong. And you know who the perpetrator is? Well, that perpetrator has to be punished or respectfully has to be investigated and in the due process of law. And that is justice. Not a big question, it's a very natural understanding. And those who don't understand it have become so perverted, like in so many issues of armed conflict. That is when the question arises, why do people turn into animals in times of war? And the reason is maybe because we don't really judge crime of war. We're good at war crimes, prosecuting them, but of the crimes of all crimes is the crime of war, the crime of aggression. And now we have a special tribunal that has been set up in The Hague, that has been organized by the European Council and Ukraine. And this special tribunal is for war of aggression against Ukraine. So specifically, it's working towards understanding what we have not been able to do over 80 plus years is truly to try people for the crime of aggression and don't cherry pick. And if you have people in this administration or anywhere in the world, the process of law is that if they have a judicial system, they are obliged to investigate. Doesn't mean they're guilty, they're alleged. And it has to be investigated. And it can't be put off by the word of immunity. There's no immunity for war crimes. And so the idea that you have an economic interest and have a world order, which is bounded by trade, by finance, by simple livelihood, what you can buy, how much it costs, you need to involve the idea of what is the real principles about what we are doing. And why? Because again, as my colleague here to the left said, something is about environment. It goes on and on, it's a much bigger picture. But the credo, the very essence, the truth, and that is what is called the principle. And what are the principles that you believe in? You stand by them. You say, well, maybe I can do this, maybe that. There are exceptions. There are no exceptions to principles, but there are conditionalities that can be better understood and can give some understanding for why something occurs. It doesn't change, the principle remains. And this idea of ethics, the idea that you are in a transformation of where, again, justice and economic interests and all the polarities that we are facing today, is the question, where are we going? Well, what? What is, some say, well, it's the end of the new world. We don't know. Yes, we do know. We're not waiting. We are thinking about what's going to happen and must happen. Because right now, a lot of people in this country and the world are very, very upset. And they're upset because they can't survive. There are 76 conflicts on this earth right now as we speak. And they are not just small issues of a few people. There are millions. And this is where people like you and I, who have the opportunity to learn and to study and to review, to make a difference. The difference is to understand how courts can be more effective. How can they do the job for which they have been appointed and organize? And when you refer to the ICJ, well, they need better enforcement. You need to enforce their decisions. And when you come to the ICC, well, people will say, well, they want to interfere with our US personnel and all this. No. If a valid judiciary system exists, there's no need for another court to come in. It's called complementarity. If you're a failed state like Rwanda, with a genocide on your hands and no judiciary exists, now you need something else, and that is the ICC. Or a tribunal. It didn't exist at that time. But whatever it is, the word of justice is most important because it's also a part of economic trade and everything. Because your ethics in trade will reliably lead to better prosperity. But if you don't, you'll face lots of lawsuits and maybe even criminal. So the devastation of this idea is that in this transformation that we are experiencing, we need to look at what is occurring in our world, the world we understand. We look at Ukraine. We've been supporting Ukraine for 4 years, almost. And then we say, well, we've got to do it different. Or we got to find how Ukraine needs to fit into the world order. But it's the Ukrainians, not us, not somebody else. It's Ukrainians who have to make that decision. And again, it goes back to the very principle. So again, who is really the aggressor? Okay.
Thank you. But thank you to our panelists. I'd now like to open the floor to any questions or comments any of you may have, or just thoughts. Anyone attending online also can type a question or comment into the webinar chat feature. So I know this raises some questions that we've been discussing in some of our classes here. Any particular thoughts? Yes.
I guess I'm just wondering, what's the case to get superpowers on the world stage to kind of agree to submitting themselves to international arbitration? Because I think we've seen in the past 10 years, especially, that if a superpower or even if a regional power believes its national interest cuts in the opposite direction of international law, it is pretty willing to just disregard international law. I find it in the South China Sea, when the United States believed that the war on terror was in our national interest, not allowing U.S. personnel to be tried, and then now with Russia and Ukraine, obviously Vladimir Putin is not going to allow himself to be tried or anything like that.
Well, you know, there is the book by Leila Sadat and Shapiro called Internationals. And she recommends, and she does say, and this is practically what does happen when you have such rogue states, and that is outcasts. So you're outcasting the country. Now, of course, if you're very ideologically fanatic, or rather have a doctrine that will rule over other people called an authoritarian government, then you have the dictatorship. And you dictate what the people can do and not do to a large extent. So they then can say, well, I'll just do this myself, and everybody will applaud. But the reality is, if you really push this country, like China, and the United States has done some very successful ways in administering this, people listen, even in China. So it's outcasting. And it's making it clear that, okay, I could win the case, but I have more benefits by paying my fee or paying for the judgment. So it's again, benefits. If you can show a country, any state, that they have benefits, they will do them because it's in their interest.
Professor Kitry, do you have anything to respond to that question?
Yeah, I had a little bit of trouble hearing the question.
I'm
But-
sorry.
Uh,
Do you want the question repeated for you?
Yeah, if you could just repeat the question, make sure I understand it.
Can you, if you want to come up here and just speak into the microphone, that might, I know it's. That would be great, but then be able to hear you properly.
Sure. Where's the microphone?
It's picking up through the ceiling, so that's a
Okay,
good
just right where you are is fine.
Okay, is this good? Can you hear me?
Better, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So my question is just, how do you convince a superpower to submit itself to international arbitration when it believes its national interest cuts in the opposite direction of a judgment of an international court?
Yeah, so this is a very real issue, right? I mean, we have the World Trade Organization, which about 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, moved to making binding decisions potentially. The US had agreed that the World Trade Organization should be, the appellate body would be able to make binding orders on disputes relating to the GATT and other issues. And in the end, that has fallen apart. There's a national security exception to the WTO, which the US has invoked and Russia's invoked. Basically, the WTO started, the appellate body started to restrict the national security exception. And say, well, you can't just, you have to have good reasons for invoking the national security exception. And the US got upset, and both President Biden and President Trump blocked the appointment of additional members of the appellate body, and now the appellate body stopped working. So indeed, the US has hamstrung the binding capacity of the WTO. I think that if you are a superpower, you, first of all, you do maybe have a tendency to lean in the direction of might makes right, but you also have to understand that these bodies, the ICC and the ICJ, the ICC in particular, is not some paradigm of justice. I mean, the ICC is presided over by Karim Khan, who it's been clearly reported that he was ready to, in fact, undertake complementarity with regard to Israel, go visit, see if they were doing what they said they would. And then Khan was accused of rape, and he decided to go after Israel in order to distract from the rape charges against him. And, the ICC, it turns out, there have been studies done. It wasn't just Karim Khan, but the ICC parties did a study which indicated that, to give an example of how corrupt the ICC is, it's a hotbed of rape of junior officials by senior officials. And this was written in the report, which you can find. So just because an organization has the name International Criminal Court doesn't mean that it has any claim to justice or righteousness. In fact, the International Criminal Court, when they did that study of the prevalence of rape and sexual harassment, it said that senior officials at the ICC were basically treated as completely having immunity from any complaints from junior staff. So the international institution that supposedly stands for justice and righteousness is in fact a paradigm of corruption and indecency. And so, if you're the United States, under this administration or a previous administration, we've seen that senators from both sides, the US Congress has refused to submit itself to ICC jurisdiction, in part because it feared that the ICC would become exactly what it has become, which is a self-serving body whose actions have more connection to covering up rape cases by the chief prosecutor than they do to advancing any kind of agenda of justice for the world.
I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Let me rephrase that and you will confirm or not if I read your question correctly. It was about how to enforce international law against superpowers, right?
Yeah, like why should a superpower agree to be bound by international law?
Yes. So and this is it's a question which is like a perpetual question of international law. How to enforce international law when you don't have a central enforcement power like the one you have in domestic legal system, right? It's a question which is central to international law, and let me put it like this: when you enter into any kind of contractual relationship, your primary motivation to follow the contract is not that it can be enforced against you by the court or by some kind of superior authority. Your primary motivation is reciprocity, right? This is why very often we want to follow law, because we expect something in exchange. Now, what is happening in international law, and this is a theory called the theory of hegemons, hegemonic theory. It's not a theory about law, it's more about a theory from international relations for political science. And the theory will tell you one simple thing. They are, in theory, we have the principle of equality in international law, which is very formal, but in real life, you have certain states which have more power and they have a better position. And in international, on a global scale, probably you would point 3 such countries like United States, Russia, and China. So if you want to enforce law against China, probably you would have to assure that other 2 hegemons have the interest that it follows. Then you have the counterbalance. And this theory also works, for example, in European Union. In European Union, we, as Poland, we also very often face or have the impression that there are certain countries or states which have more power, like France or Germany, and it's very difficult to enforce European law against those states. They have more privileges in a very informal way, right? So the theory of hegemons would tell you that you have to bring a coalition against such a superpower, right? And also this country has to understand that it has a self-interest in following the law to which it has agreed to follow, right? Because this is a very fundamental principle of international law. So we live in a certain paradigm of legal positivism. And this paradigm of legal positivism, we believe that international law is bound upon the state only if a state has consented to it, right? This consent can be explicit through international treaty or implicit through international custom, right? If you follow certain practice, it means that you agree, okay? So, but this is only how states enter into those contractual treaty relationships. Then there's the enforcement comes, and of course there's always a problem of motivation. I think, for example, what is happening in WTO, United States has less motivation to follow it. There was certain moment in time, we do not know exactly when, especially say it was at the end of Barack Obama administration, it was not under Trump administration, when the United States realized that following WTO law regulations brings more loss than benefits. That's why it started contesting appellate body. That's why it started blocking different processes, because it has realized that if it remains as it is, we lose against China a lot of money, right? But without building an alternative architecture in that field, the only thing you can do is to contest by not following certain rules and by not caring at all, right? So reciprocity would be my simplest answer. You have to assure that those superpowers believe that they will have something in exchange in order to follow international law.
Thank you. So we have a question that came across the webinar chat, which I think I'll direct first to Professor Kittrey, which I probably see the question, Professor Kittrey, in the webinar chat. It's asking, other than the ICC, and I think probably also the ICJ, can the UN keep Russia accountable for its war crimes? And is there any other way that Russia can be prosecuted, or present its leaders? So thoughts on that, and that might go to some of your questions also about what more could be done economically by the global community to prevent some of the realities that you spoke to about technology, Western technology, and ineffectiveness of sanctions thus far.
Yeah, so I think the question is a very good one. Other than, and I do see it in front of me, other than the ICC, can the UN still keep Russia accountable for its war crimes? And if not, is there any way that Russia or any of the P5 members can be removed to be so I think that the way to go after, to hold Russia accountable for its war crimes is not, unfortunately, going to be through the ICC, which has discredited itself and been totally ineffective, or through the UN. The challenge with the UN is indeed there's the permanent five at the Security Council, and they have a veto. So the UN can't take binding action against Russia because Russia will veto it. There have been some Security Council some General Assembly, resolutions, which Russia has lost. But of course, the General Assembly does not have the authority to take legally binding actions against really any member state. Only the Security Council has the authority to take legally binding actions against member states. So I think the UN is not the place to hold Russia accountable. I mean, I wish it were. I wish we had a different UN. I wish we had a different ICC, but we don't. It seems to me that the ways to hold Russia accountable are, first of all, the easy things to do are those that I described, which is in the economic realm. We need to stop Russia's sale of oil, which is raising just about as much money as it is costing Russia to wage the war against Ukraine. And we need to do more to make sure that Western microchips are not ending up in the weapons that Russia is using against Ukraine. Those are the relatively easy moves to make. And I am astonished in many ways that the West has not done a better job of undertaking those. In terms of criminal responsibility, my sense is that probably one is either going to need to create some kind of a new kind of Yugoslav war tribunal for Russia, or one is going to need to rely on universal jurisdiction prosecutions. Some countries have laws that enable them to prosecute people for war crimes, even when the perpetrator and the victim are not connected to the state that has that court. It seems to me that's a way of doing it. It seems to me also, and I took the point by the professor about sort of naming and shaming, and I think a lot more needs to be done to name and shame. I think one of the reasons why we only have 45, right? There are 193 members of the UN, and only 45 of them are imposing sanctions against Russia. And many of the world's largest economies are not serious about sanctions against Russia. That includes India and China and various others. And there's a kind of a propaganda battle that needs to be waged, and the US and its allies are falling behind. We need to be, what Putin and his ilk are doing is atrocious, and we need to be waging a propaganda battle to bring that to the world's attention. It's not only atrocious, it also happens to be violations of international law. Since law has become tantamount to legitimacy in this day and age, I think we need to do more to bring those atrocities home. They don't seem to be resonating in the way that they should. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. You were sort of about the role of the UN as designed with the Security Council, and ways, to hold Russia accountable. I wonder if Professor Regenbogen, you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I beg to differ because right now, re-exported Russian oil is banned to the United States and to Europe. And there is now a phasing out of all imports, gas and oil, from Russia in Europe. So there's an extreme amount of improvement on those tools that should have been used immediately on February 24th, 2022. And that is because of economic interests. We knew about diamonds, and diamonds were allowed to be traded because they're so important for the industry, for high tech. And yet it was economic interests instead of values, morals, and the principles that were not executed or even observed. So in that respect, the issue of hydrocarbons is now under duress. And that is perhaps late, but it is now. And as far as the ICC is concerned, I think the report and how legitimate and genuine it is will instigate an immediate appraise by the Justice Department, wherever that jurisdiction might be, and it will be investigated. And again, the president of the ICC will be included into that investigation because it is the reputation and integrity of the institution. And the place where you can hear the most is the Nuremberg Academy in Nuremberg, who again teaches judges and lawyers to begin to understand the rule of law. And that is a forum where you can look at very clearly what is going on in terms of such allegation in the report. And I have not read it in its full. Eli Rosenbaum wrote an amicus to the ICC court regarding the alleged, or rather the warrant of arrest for Netanyahu and Gaza. But again, that's an example of a respected jurist who was a second man in the Justice Department for many, many decades, and whose job was to prosecute Nazi perpetrators.
Thank you. Professor Schmedow?
Maybe I could just add one minor thing when you talk about Russia's position in the energy sector. Mostly when you talk about this, we mostly think gas and oil, but there's also another important factor that Russia, especially in post-Soviet countries, exported nuclear technology. is something that is very problematic for Hungary, for example. Hungary is a relatively small country. They have one nuclear plant, which is in the little city of Paks. And it was constructed in the 1980s. I'm not an engineer, especially and a specialist in nuclear technologies, but I have a friend who told me that it's like getting married. Once you buy a technology, you have to rely on the technology of this particular supplier, right, for decades. It's very difficult to be replaced. This is what actually is putting Hungary in a very difficult position because they have this nuclear plant and now replacing it. I'm sure it's not the only reason, but this is one of the very important reasons why, for example, Hungary, but also Slovakia, are two countries which are inside of the European Union contestators and blocking powers for going farther with the sanction against Russia. Sometimes people do not necessarily remember this factor, which is small but important.
And of course, that sort of ties into some of what you said about the original lines, the original First World War lines being drawn in Eastern Europe that perhaps sowed some of the seeds of some of the problems that led to the Second World War, where we have countries like Slovakia, which, as my students know, in public international law, I read a famous case about a hydroelectric construction under a treaty that was then disputed by both parties after Hungary wanted to pull out of the treaty after the change away from communism. But Slovakia, of course, is 10% Hungarian speaking. And so there have always been incredible tensions, I think, in those communities, in Romania, in former parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after a lot of those lines were drawn, and we still see those kinds of tensions. We see them also in post-colonial states in Africa and Asia, where lines were somewhat arbitrarily drawn, or arguably the Mideast, is that way as well, which is interesting. Other questions, thoughts?
Yeah.
Yes. So again, if you could come up, because I think it's hard for Professor Kitry to hear you. If you just walk up, sort of right to this area here, I think he can. Then your voice will be picked up.
You have to talk like the court.
I know. Yeah. Address
Well, very nice exposition. Thank you so much. My question, was this topic of the war between Russia and Ukraine? It's clear that who has liability and before who, but I would say that this impacts also many other countries. For example, I don't know what kind of liabilities Russia may have before Poland. What kind of things, what the war great for Poland, or what kind of things you are losing? For example, I was there some years ago, and I remember that you paid so much social security for the refugees, and the impact for the refugees. I don't know how big could be and what kind of liability, international liability may be there.
from Poland, that question.
Let me try. Well, in the law of international responsibility, we do make this distinction, which comes from the Roman law, that there are certain obligations which are inter partes, so between the two contractual sides, and which are erga omnes, something that we owe to the whole community, right? And if we agree that certain obligations are erga omnes, anyone may come and may sue. And prohibition of aggression, this is what happened, is an obligation which has an erga omnes character. So in the ideal world, Poland could sue Russia and we would win the case. But this is just a very utopian vision of international law. So the theoretical answer is very simple. The implementation and enforcement of this solution is very difficult.
Other thoughts, panelists, Professor Kitchen?
So I'm not going to address that particularly, but I want to build on a comment that was made by one of the two professors, which I think is very correct, which is that, and let me say, I am not I am not MAGA, but I talk to Congress all the time and to the administration all the time, and here's their perspective on what has happened. Their perspective is that the U.S. for decades has been the only one to largely abide by international law, while China cheated and cheated and cheated and cheated and cheated. And China has cheated using proxies, and China has cheated by stealing U.S. intellectual property. The Biden administration estimated China was stealing $500 billion a year in U.S. intellectual property in various ways. There is a very interesting sort of set of speeches, including by Chris Wray, who was the FBI director under Biden, talking about this. And so the U.S. now, if you were to talk to the administration, they would say that, Clinton opened the doors to China, welcomed China into the World Trade Organization. There was a gamble there. There was an assumption that as China traded with the world, China would become more law-abiding and more peace-oriented, and its government would become more democratic. But the view is that that gamble failed, and that China is now more aggressive than it was. It's more authoritarian than it was, and it's cheating just as much as it did before. So the question becomes, from a U.S. perspective, what do you do when your leading rival is just completely blowing through every international law there is out there? And the NGOs are holding the U.S. accountable, and the courts are not helpful. What do you do? What is your next move? And the administration obviously is taking a sledgehammer to the ICC. They have imposed sanctions not only on Karim Khan, but on some of his deputies and on the judges. The administration has obviously given up on the ICC and thinks the ICC is a net negative. And both this administration and the Biden administration obviously decided that the WTO, and I think one of the professors mentioned this, there was a decision, I think maybe going back to the Obama administration, that the WTO had become a net negative for the US. So what do you do when, and I write about this in my book, what do you do when you, as the US, are, yes, often violating, but largely abiding by the international law of trade and other international laws? And why do you abide more? Because you have Congress, you have courts, you have transparency that holds you accountable. Whereas the PRC, and I could give example after example of where the People's Republic of China, they will say they're abiding, but they're not. They're lying. And they do this with regard to the South China Sea and so many other things. So I think, as Professor Regenbogen mentioned, we've now reached a pivot point with regard to international law. And I think, certainly from the perspective of this administration, that's what the pivot point looks like. The idea that the U.S. has been abiding and abiding for 30 years. It hasn't served us well. It's ended up hollowing out our economy. It's ended up strengthening our adversaries. And the question is, what do we do now?
So I will give the other two panelists maybe a chance to say a final word themselves before we need to break, because there are classes that start soon. For those of you that are here, there will be some refreshments in the lobby. I'm sorry that our online people cannot be. So anyway, thank you very much, attendees, and just to give a final word to first, Professor Shvedo and then Professor Regenbogen.
Thank you very much. So as a final note, I would just put it in the following way, that I believe what links international trade law, Nuremberg Principles, is also this common denominator of natural law. I believe that the principle of free trade, so the idea that we exchange goods, is a very primary idea, which is very intuitive for us. So I believe that despite different disruptions and problems which we face, this idea will survive. We don't know to what extent. We do not know how it has to be reformed and how it has to be reshaped in international relations. But as the Nuremberg Principles survive and will survive as a certain legal paradigm, even if it's not always can be enforced against Vladimir Putin and others, it remains as a certain eternal paradigm for lawyers and also for law students. The same applies to the idea of free trade in my intuition.
The whole concept of free trade is about having a fair playing ground. So if you compete in a free market about competition, and if you can't compete, you find excuses, a way out. In court, if you have proof that there's corruption, bring it to the court. Let us see it. The court will acknowledge, and they will judge. The question is there real evidence? Or is this a political excuse for not being able to compete? There is all types of reasons, and they've been explained in many times, that a third world has no worker comp and no laws for the workers, and children work too. So we begin in the United States to say, if we don't have products like this which meet our standards, we don't import them. And corporations have a brand. That's the capitalist system. And that brand will be tarnished, and shareholders will punish. Works. The question is, how involved do the government want to get in terms of upholding a fair playing field? I question the entire operations. There's no doubt, in my opinion, China does not observe these rules and regulations. Example, the permanent arbitration of Taiwan and China versus China, and the amount of money that was to be disposed or be given by China to Taiwan was ignored. So again, this is an example of where a superpower doesn't care. And again, the only way you can make any country, state, or anyone, because it's a basic element of our entire world order, states have the power to enforce. If you want them to enforce, they must have benefits. And if they don't have the benefits, they have the downside. And they have to be cruel. They have to be really something that is demonstrative to say, I better not do this. And if a country like Turkey, who has no intellectual property, and we have a part of our NATO, we don't have to look to China. We have to ask ourselves, why don't we enforce the laws we have in this country to expect it from our allies or from the others who deal with us in this market? So this market is important to many, many countries. So let's use this as leverage. And let's use it so we can get a leveraged playing field. And that means that we play by the rules and not exception. We don't go to Iraq without a UN approval, affirmation. We don't invade another country just because we think it's a threat when it's not an immediate threat. And I don't need to go on. I think everybody knows what we're talking about. And this is where we have to be, as a leader of a country, remain to understand this is a playing field. And we need to commit ourselves to really participating as an equal and not as an exception.
So thank you to all three panelists for such an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And so I'd like